Hi everyone! In this video we're going to learn how to find values of inverse trigonometric functions. Be sure to watch the previous video where I explained the idea of the inverse trigonometric functions. It's going to help you to understand the steps that we're about to take. For the first example, we need to find value of arc cosine of negative square root of 3 over 2. Arc cosine, that's inverse cosine functions, and it's one of the two notations. This is how we think of finding its value. So first of all, we need to remind ourselves that when we work with inverse trigonometric functions, the input is always some real number, and the output, or what that inverse function equals to, is the angle measure. But this angle measure has to be restricted to a certain interval. For cosine, it's interval from 0 to pi. In other words, angle from quadrants 1 and 2 between 0 and pi. If I put this all together, then this is what I have to do. I need to find an angle between 0 and pi such that its cosine value is negative radical 3 over 2. So now I have to look at the unit circle a bit closer. What angle between 0 and pi has cosine value negative radical 3 over 2? We know that cosine values are represented by the x-coordinates of points along the unit circle. So here I can see the x-coordinate negative radical 3 over 2, and it corresponds to angle 5 pi over 6. That means that arc cosine of negative radical 3 over 2 is 5 pi over 6. So yeah, easy like that. So basically there are two things that you always want to keep in mind. So first of all, the inverse trigonometric functions produce angle measures. And second, those angle measures have to be within certain interval. For the inverse cosine function, that interval between 0 and pi. Let's try another example. This time we need to find sine inverse, and that's another notation for the inverse trigonometric function, of negative radical 2 over 2. We already talked about how we're going to have to find some angle measure, and that angle has to come from the specific interval that is associated with the inverse sine function. And that would be interval that covers quadrant 1 and quadrant 4. However, we have to be careful. This interval cannot start at 3 pi over 2 and go to pi over 2. That would be going backwards. This interval is going to start at negative pi over 2 and go to pi over 2. And because of that, angles that we're going to see in quadrant 4 are negative angles. Okay, so let's see what's going to be actually the answer for our question here. After what we just said, we realize that we need to find an angle between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2 such that its sine value is negative radical 2 over 2. Now, sine values correspond to the y-coordinates of the points around the unit circle. So in quadrants 1 and 4, I need to find a point with y-coordinate negative radical 2 over 2. Since it's a negative value, of course, I'll find it in quadrant 4. Here it is. And what is the corresponding angle? Again, we know that in quadrant 4, we're working with negative angles in this case. So it's going to be angle negative pi over 4. Negative pi over 4. That's going to be the answer. Finally, let's try to find value of arctangent of negative 1. Arctangent is the inverse tangent function. Again, we start by recalling that the range restriction for inverse tangent, in other words, interval from which the answer is going to be, is the interval from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, similar to the restriction for inverse sine function. The only difference is that negative pi over 2 and pi over 2 themselves are not included in that interval. So our goal is to find an angle between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2 such that its tangent value is negative 1. Well, we know that tangent values are not shown on the unit circle. Therefore, we're going to look at the table. In the table, we see that tangent equals 1 for angle pi over 4, right? Tangent equals 1 for angle pi over 4. Okay, so that means that our answer is going to be either pi over 4 or angle related to pi over 4. Let's go back to the unit circle. Which quadrant should we look at? Quadrant 1 or quadrant 4? Well, the fact that we need to find angle such that its tangent value is -1 means that we have to look at quadrant 4. That's where tangent has negative values. Well, an angle that's related to pi over 4 is going to be negative pi over 4 in quadrant 4. Because once again, when we work with inverse sine or tangent functions, quadrant 4 contains negative angles. So the answer to this question will be negative pi over 4. So that's how you find the inverse function values.